Today we'll be talking about Part 7 of Capital Volume 1, called The Accumulation of Capital. That's chapters 23, 24, and 25. By accumulation, Marx here refers to the growth of the scale of capitalist production over time. We're starting with chapter 23, called Simple Reproduction. In Part 7, The Accumulation of Capital, Marx widens his frame of analysis. Instead of talking about a single circuit of M, C, M prime, he asks, what happens when we view this as a continuous process? Marx says, a society can no more cease to produce than it could cease to consume. When viewed, therefore, as a connected whole, and in the constant flux of its incessant renewal, every social process of production is at the same time a process of reproduction. When looked at in this way, capitalism does not only produce commodities and surplus value, it also reproduces the conditions under which capitalist accumulation can continue. Marx gives us an example of a production process where a capitalist advances $1,000 and puts it into the MC M prime cycle. So M equals $1,000, and at the end of the cycle, M prime is $1,200. The workers have created $200 in surplus value and preserved the $1,000 originally advanced. In this example of what Marx calls simple reproduction, the capitalist consumes all of the $200 in surplus value for their own personal consumption, and then starts a new cycle where again M equals $1,000 and M prime equals $1,200. So what happens after 5 cycles? The capitalist will have consumed $200 times 5 equal $1,000, the equivalent of what he originally advanced. Now it's the capitalist's argument that because the original $1,000 was his property, that justifies his claim to take the $200 in surplus value the workers produced. Now where that original $1,000 actually comes from is of great interest, but for that we're going to have to wait for the next lecture on primitive accumulation. But for the purposes of this example, Marx in effect says, let's pretend that it is true that the original $1,000 was the capitalist property. I will still show you how your argument is wrong. Now, as the capitalist is about to embark on the 6th cycle, Marx says, when he has consumed the equivalent of his original capital, the value of his present capital represents nothing but the total amount of surplus value appropriated by him without payment. So why should the capitalist have any claim on the surplus value produced on the advance of the $1,000 that was entirely created by his workers? When we pull the frame back from consideration of a single worker and capitalist in a single circuit of MC-M prime and consider the working class and the capitalist class as a whole in a continuous circuit, we break the illusions created by the marketplace. So when the capitalist class pays the working class wages, they are merely giving the working class a small portion of what the working class itself has produced in the past. And when we take those wages to buy the commodities we need, we're just getting back a small portion of what we, as a class, have ourselves produced. But the working class as a whole is not given so much in wages to allow us to escape the CMC circuit. We still are kept separate from the means of production, so no matter how much surplus value we produce for the capitalist, at the end of each cycle, we must again sell our labor power to the capitalist in order to get the wages we need to survive. As Marx says, therefore, the worker, him or herself, constantly produces wealth in the form of capital, an alien power that dominates and exploits them, and the capitalist just as constantly produces the worker as a wage laborer. This incessant reproduction, this perpetuation of the worker, is the absolutely necessary condition for capitalist production. Like a kind of Frankenstein's monster, capital is at once our creation as well as the source of our torment. Marx concludes chapter 23 by saying, the capitalist process of production, therefore, seen as a total connected process, a process of reproduction, produces not only commodities, not only surplus value, but it also produces and reproduces the capital relation itself, on the one hand the capitalist, and on the other hand the wage laborer. Building on the idea of simple reproduction, where the capitalist consumes all of the surplus value produced in an MC-M' circuit, Marx now turns to expanded reproduction, or what he calls accumulation, where the capitalist reinvests a portion of the surplus value into the next circuit of production. So each successive starting M in the MC-M' cycle is now larger than the previous M. So if simple reproduction is a circle, expanded reproduction is an ever-widening spiral. But why should a capitalist reinvest the surplus value they have taken from their workers, rather than just spend it all on their own luxury consumption? They are compelled to by the coercive laws of competition. If they don't, their competitors will, and they'll be driven out of business. Marx says, the development of capitalist production makes it constantly necessary to keep increasing the amount of capital laid out in a given industrial undertaking, and competition makes the immanent laws of capitalist production to be felt by each individual capitalist as external coercive laws. It compels him to keep constantly extending his capital in order to preserve it, but extend it he cannot except by means of progressive accumulation. Capitalists reinvest in order to stay in business and to preserve their social power and class position as capitalists. Imagine a capitalist involved in automobile manufacturing around 1900. This required highly skilled laborers to manufacture and assemble the hundreds of parts needed to create an internal combustion engine and the rest of the car. Different automobile manufacturing capitalists had slightly different approaches to production, and as their cars were sold on the market, a social average representative of the socially necessary labor time it took to produce a car emerged. Now along comes Henry Ford, who implements the moving assembly line in 1913, which was a technological revolution in auto production. This enabled him to do two things. First, to de-skill his workers, and second, to precisely control the intensity of their labor. He no longer needed highly skilled workers who could work across different stages of the process of auto production. He just needed workers who could do one or two specific things as the car came to their station on the assembly line. And by simply ordering the speed of the assembly line increased, he could force all of his workforce to work faster and in unison. His increased investment in constant capital in the form of the moving assembly line allowed him to reduce his costs in variable capital, or labor power. He increased the productivity of his labor, and by doing so was able to reduce the individual value of his cars below the social value of his competitors. In 1908, a Ford Model T sold for $825, and by 1925, it sold for only $260. Now, Ford was able to make a car of the same quality for a third of the price of his competitors. By his pursuit of relative surplus value, he's now in a position to make more profit by increasing his market share. His competitors were faced with a choice: either find a way to also increase their investments in constant capital like the assembly line, or another technology that increased the productivity of their workers by 3 times, or watch Ford steal their market share and drive them out of business. Marx says, accumulate, accumulate, that is Moses and the prophets. Accumulation for the sake of accumulation, production for the sake of production. This is to say, the gospel of capitalism is growth. Capitalism demands growth. All barriers to growth, whether they be environmental, or social, or geopolitical, must be smashed. When capitalism does not have sufficient growth, it goes into crisis. This is a unique feature of the capitalist mode of production compared to the prior ones, and obviously an urgent question for all of us today. Now that Marx has established the idea of expanded reproduction, or accumulation, he sets it in the context of continuous technological revolution and examines the effects on the working class. It's very important to note that Marx's conclusions here are not meant as predictions of what will necessarily happen in capitalism. In the beginning of section 7, he explicitly lays out the assumptions he's working from. First, that there are no problems in the market. All commodities trade at their value. Marx will take up the problems of circulation in volume 2. Second, all surplus value accrues to the industrial capitalist. He will take up the way surplus value is distributed to different sectors of capital, like the profit that goes to merchant capital, the interest that goes to finance capital, and the rent that goes to landlords in Volume 3. Marx first develops his concept of the composition of capital. This is quite involved, but only becomes really important in his discussion of crisis theory in Volume 3. For the purposes of his argument here, we will simplify and say that the composition of capital is simply C over V, where C is constant capital, or the value of means of production, and V is variable capital, or the value of labor power. Marx then shows that if capital accumulation were to proceed without technological change, in other words, if constant and variable capital remained in the same ratio to each other as they both grow, then the demand for labor power will necessarily grow. Marx says, accumulation of capital is therefore multiplication of the proletariat. If the capitalist encounters a limit to the supply of labor power that they need to expand, then wages will rise. This is good for the working class, but does not abolish exploitation. In Marx's words, it only means that the length and weight of the golden chain the wage laborer has already forged for him or herself is loosened somewhat. A reduction of the demand for labor power will of course cause wages to fall. Now, when we let go of our assumptions of accumulation without technological change and allow the productivity of labor to rise, things get really interesting. Marx has already established the drive towards technological innovation in the competitive pursuit of relative surplus value. What happens then is an increase in the constant capital relative to the variable capital, or another way of saying the same thing, an increase in the means of production compared to labor power. Marx says, a point is reached in the course of accumulation at which the development of the productivity of social labor becomes the most powerful lever of accumulation. Technological and organizational changes raise the productivity of labor and accelerate the process of accumulation. As accumulation accelerates, it leads to and is also dependent on the concentration and centralization of capital. By concentration, Marx means that as accumulation increases and grows at a compound rate, we see the increasing mass of capital concentrated in a few capitalist hands. The centralization of capital is the takeovers, mergers, the driving of smaller firms out of business and buying up of their assets. As centralization and concentration increase, they tend to raise the productivity of labor and increase the ratio of constant to variable capital in the composition of capital. As the composition of capital rises, the demand for labor power falls relatively. Marx says, capitalist accumulation itself constantly produces, and produces in the direct ratio of its own energy and extent, a relatively redundant working population, a population which is superfluous to capital's average requirements for its own valorization, and therefore a surplus population. Note that this surplus population is only redundant or superfluous from the point of view of the capitalist looking to make profit. Marx is here directly attacking Malthusian arguments that are still with us today, that claim that there's just too many people for the Earth's resources to sustain, or that working class people have too many children they can't support. These are malicious lies. It is true that capitalism produces enormous, obscene wealth for a tiny handful of people, but it's also true that capitalism is a giant poverty-producing machine. Capitalism produces poverty no matter what the population rate is. One way capitalism creates poverty is by creating a relative surplus population of workers by the use of technology to throw them out of work. The creation of a permanent pool of unemployed workers is a necessary condition for capitalist accumulation. Marx says, but if a surplus population of workers is a necessary product of accumulation, or the development of wealth on a capitalist basis, this surplus population becomes, conversely, the lever of capitalistic accumulation. Indeed, it becomes a condition for the existence of the capitalist mode of production. It forms a disposable industrial reserve army, which belongs to capital just as absolutely as if the latter had bred it at its own cost. The relative surplus population of the poor stands as a warning to what will happen to employed workers if they do not comply with the capitalist demands. Do what the boss says, or you'll end up like them. This threat becomes a lever to increase the intensity of work of the employed workers. Thus, as Marx says, the condemnation of one part of the working class to enforced idleness by the overwork of the other part, and vice versa, becomes a means of enriching the individual capitalists. Apologists for capitalism tell us that capitalism will deliver prosperity for all eventually. That what's good for the owning class is what's good for all of us. These too are lies. What Marx has shown is that the opposite is true. He says, in proportion as capital accumulates, the situation of the worker, be their payment high or low, must grow worse. This is what Marx calls the general law of capitalist accumulation. Marx says, accumulation of wealth at one pole is therefore at the same time accumulation of misery, the torment of labor, slavery, ignorance, and brutalization at the opposite pole. Capitalism cannot produce the wealth to create billionaires without simultaneously producing the immiseration of billions of human beings. In 2020, even before the COVID crisis greatly exacerbated inequality, the world's 2,153 billionaires had more wealth than the 4.6 billion people who make up the 60% of the planet's population, according to a report by Oxfam. The 22 richest men in the world have more wealth than all of the women on the African continent put together. This is the direct result of the general law of capitalist accumulation, and it will not end until we end capitalism.